In the dusty streets of Galilee, under a relentless sun, the disciples of Jesus walked unnoticed by most. They carried no wealth, wore no finery, and yet their presence would change the course of history. But what did they truly wear? Were their robes the flowing garments we imagine from paintings and films, or were they humble pieces of cloth, patched and worn from years of labor and travel? This question, simple at first glance, opens a window into the lives of men who lived on the margins, yet whose footsteps echoed through eternity. Imagine Peter, Simon of Bethsaida, leaving his fishing nets behind. His hands, calloused from labor, would have been hidden beneath sleeves that were likely rough, coarse, and plain. Scholars suggest that the common attire of Galilean men in the first century consisted of tunics, simple, knee-length garments tied at the waist with a leather belt, and over them a heavier mantle for the cold nights. Sandals protected their feet, though often little more than strips of leather. There were no intricate patterns, no brilliant dyes for these men. The colors came from natural fibers, muted browns, creams, and faded blues, the shades of earth and sky. Consider Andrew walking alongside his brother Peter. Each step along the shoreline was a lesson in resilience. Their garments, though plain, bore the story of their work. Frayed hems, stains of fish and sea, repairs where threads had given way. These were not costumes for theatrical effect, they were the fabric of daily survival. In imagining them, we confront a profound truth. Greatness in the kingdom often arrives dressed in humility. The clothes of the disciples were not meant to impress, but to endure. The Gospel of Luke offers subtle hints about these details. It speaks not of opulent robes, but of sandals, cloaks, and tunics, of bread broken and hands washed after labor. The imagery, while sparse, points to lives steeped in simplicity. Some scholars suggest that even the mantle, that outer layer often depicted in artistic renderings as flowing and majestic, would have been coarse wool, heavy enough to ward off the chill of Galilean evenings, yet plain enough to show the wear of constant travel. Imagine the disciples, huddled together at night, their rough mantles drawn close, sharing warmth more than style, more than comfort. Yet there is poetry in the plainness. In their simplicity, the disciples became symbols of a spiritual truth. It is not the fabric that shapes a man, but the fiber of his character. Their clothes tell us a story of endurance and devotion. A disciple's tunic may have been patched repeatedly, each stitch a testament to perseverance, each fray a silent witness to nights spent under the stars, preaching, praying, or simply walking from village to village. And though these details are easily overlooked, they matter. They remind us that history is lived in the ordinary, and that faith often wears humility as its badge. There is an intimacy in considering their garments, an opportunity to step closer to the human reality behind the sacred narrative. We tend to see them in art, immaculate robes, flowing capes, dramatic gestures. But the real disciples were men of the land, of the sea, of dusty roads and modest homes. Their appearance was shaped by necessity, not fashion. Their lives were shaped by purpose, not vanity. And in understanding what they wore, we come closer to understanding who they were. People committed to a mission far greater than themselves, bound not by luxury, but by loyalty and faith. Even the act of washing a robe carried meaning. In the heat of Galilee, garments absorbed sweat, dust, and the scent of the sea. To care for them, to mend them, was not merely practical, it was a ritual of respect for the gift of work and the calling of God. Each stitch and fold, each careful repair, reflected a life lived deliberately, attentively, with consciousness of God's presence in the small and the mundane. Their clothes were a silent sermon, proclaiming humility, service, and devotion to all who looked closely enough to see. We can also ponder the contrast between the disciples and the religious elites of their time. The Pharisees and Sadducees wore garments that marked status, fringes and fine fabrics, ornate embroidery signaling wealth and influence. The disciples' plain robes, in turn, were a statement of separation from worldly pride. Every patch, every faded thread was a quiet declaration that their allegiance was not to social hierarchy, but to the kingdom. Their outward simplicity mirrored the inward transformation that they carried within. Hearts open to God, hands ready to serve, minds attuned to the teachings of the Messiah. And so, as we try to picture these men, we must strip away the layers of artistic imagination and cultural myth. Peter, James, John, Matthew, they were not the colorful icons of stained glass or Renaissance paintings. They were men who carried burdens, endured hunger, braved storms, and walked in sandals across unforgiving terrain. Their robes were the literal and figurative cloth of their mission, woven into every step, every conversation, every act of faith. In contemplating their attire, we are invited into a meditation on the essence of discipleship itself, that greatness is measured not by appearance or comfort, but by courage, obedience, and love. And here lies the subtle wonder. The forgotten clothes of the disciples are not merely a historical curiosity. They are a mirror. They ask us, in our own lives, what do we wear to face the world? How does our outer layer reflect our inner calling? Perhaps, in noticing the simplicity of their garments, we begin to recognize the elegance of humility, the beauty of endurance, and the power of devotion. It is in these quiet details that we encounter the resonance of a faith lived fully, not for spectacle, but for purpose. If this reflection stirs something in you, leave a word below so others know they are not alone in seeking the truth behind what history often overlooks. The journey of the disciples was one marked by both hardship and profound transformation, and their clothing, so often overlooked, serves as a silent witness to their daily realities. In first-century Judea, garments were functional, reflecting the rhythms of life, work, travel, prayer, and service. The tunic, or chiton, worn by each man, was a simple, knee-length garment, usually made from undyed wool or linen. It was not designed for comfort or elegance, but for resilience. Some scholars suggest that wealthier men might have had tunics dyed in muted shades of indigo or ochre, but for the disciples the cloth was almost certainly plain. The fabric was coarse, the seams thick, the hems mended repeatedly with hands familiar with labor and necessity. Simon Peter, who would become a cornerstone of the early church, likely wore a tunic faded from years of toil by the Sea of Galilee. His feet, protected by sandals, bore the calluses of countless journeys over rock and sand. One can almost see him setting out at dawn, carrying a small bag of provisions, the hem of his garment damp from the morning dew. His mantle, heavier and woolen, draped across his shoulders, offered both warmth and modesty. In the evenings, when he gathered with his fellow disciples, that same mantle became a shared blanket, a communal shield against the chill of night. It was utilitarian, yes, but it also symbolized the interconnectedness of their mission, the shared burdens of their calling. James and John, sons of Zebedee, followed a similar pattern. Their garments, though plain, bore signs of their daily labor, small tears along the hem, stains of fish and water, patches sewn with care and intent. The Gospels do not dwell on these details, but archaeological evidence and historical texts paint a picture of everyday reality. Men whose lives were inseparable from the land, the sea, and the rhythm of human toil. Every patch, every frayed edge, is testimony to perseverance. Their clothing was a reflection not of vanity, but of purpose, and in this purpose lay a quiet nobility that surpasses any ornamentation. Matthew, the tax collector turned disciple, offers an interesting contrast. Though he might have been more familiar with coins than fishing nets, his attire would not have been luxurious. The mantle of a man accustomed to a sedentary vocation may have been slightly cleaner or more intact, yet it would still have been plain. The moment he left his desk and followed Jesus, he stepped into a life where clothing became a companion to humility and service. His outer appearance, much like that of the others, told a story of abandonment of comfort and status in favor of faith and mission. Even Judas Iscariot, whose story ended in betrayal, would have worn similar garments. His outer mantle may have hidden the coins he carried, but it could not conceal the tension within. The uniformity of their dress, the simplicity of their robes, emphasizes a subtle truth. In the kingdom, external appearance cannot mask internal disposition. The plainness of their clothing highlights the contrast between human intentions and divine purpose, reminding us that God's calling transcends earthly status or elegance. Traveling between towns, the disciples would have faced harsh conditions. Hot days, cold nights, sudden storms and rough terrain tested both their endurance and their clothing. Their tunics soaked with sweat, their mantles heavy with rain, their sandals worn thin. Every journey left an imprint not just on their bodies, but on the garments that accompanied them. Some scholars suggest that in these conditions, the mantle also served a secondary purpose: protection against dust and the occasional thorns or branches encountered on narrow paths. Even what seems mundane, a hem torn or a thread pulled, reveals a life lived fully in obedience to God, where survival and service intersect. The clothing of the disciples also offered insight into social and cultural identity. In a world governed by visible markers of status, the simple tunic marked them as common men. Unlike the Pharisees, who wore fringed garments to signify piety and wealth, the disciples' robes carried no such messages. Their attire was neutral, almost invisible in the marketplace or the synagogue, yet it signaled their true allegiance. They were defined not by external appearance, but by action, devotion, and presence. And in this, we find a paradox. The simplest garments carry the deepest meaning. We can also glimpse moments of intimacy through these garments. When Jesus washed the feet of his disciples, he touched not only their skin, but the cloth of their daily lives. Each robe, each sandal, absorbed the labor and love of ordinary moments, moments of service, teaching, and companionship. The tactile reality of their clothing anchors the narrative in human experience, bridging the gap between the sacred and the ordinary. Every fold, every thread, is a testament to the reality of discipleship. That devotion often resides in the mundane, in the repeated acts of care, in the resilience of fabric and spirit alike. And so, as we reconstruct their attire, we also reconstruct the disciples themselves. Peter, James, John, Matthew, and the others were men shaped by the earth, by the sun, by labor and devotion. Their clothing, plain and worn, was a living record of their journey. It whispered of hardship and endurance, of faithfulness and humility. In understanding what they wore, we come closer to understanding the rhythms of their lives, the weight of their mission, and the quiet dignity that marked their every step. It is worth reflecting. If we look closely, what stories do our own clothes tell about us? Are they merely decoration, or do they testify to purpose, resilience, and the choices we make each day? In pondering the garments of the first disciples, we are invited to notice the sacred in the ordinary, and to consider how even the simplest things can bear witness to a life of devotion. If this glimpse into their world moved you, take a moment to share your thoughts below. Let others see the quiet power of humble faith. The story of the disciples' clothing invites us into reflection, for it is not merely about fabric, but about the way we live and bear witness in our own lives. We often overlook the ordinary details, the sandals worn thin, the tunic patched repeatedly, and yet in these details lies a profound lesson. What we wear, how we carry ourselves, and the choices we make in the simplest acts can reveal the state of our hearts, the resilience of our faith, and our willingness to follow a higher calling. The disciples remind us that devotion is expressed in both grand gestures and the quiet endurance of daily life. Imagine walking the streets of your own life with the awareness of this truth. Each day, we put on more than clothes, we put on attitudes, priorities, and patterns of thought. Are they patched and worn with humility, or carefully tailored to impress others? The disciples' robes were a mirror to their hearts, simple, practical, and devoted to a purpose far beyond personal comfort or acclaim. Peter's tunic, patched from labor, teaches us that perseverance and faithfulness matter more than appearance. In our own work, relationships, or moments of trial, the clothing we carry, our patience, integrity, and love, speaks louder than any outward display. Consider Matthew leaving his tax booth to follow Jesus. His robe may have been slightly cleaner than the others, but the act of stepping into the unknown transformed both his heart and his attire. It is a metaphor for our own journey. When we answer a call to change, to serve, or to act in alignment with faith, our outward life inevitably reflects that transformation. It is not about superficial alteration, but about a tangible alignment between belief and practice. Just as the disciples' garments bore witness to their mission, our choices, small and ordinary as they may seem, become a testimony to the world. There is also an invitation here to embrace humility. In a culture obsessed with appearances, the disciples' simple clothing reminds us that value is not in what is seen, but in what is lived. How often do we prioritize impression over substance, fashion over function, recognition over service? The call is to let our lives, like the disciples' tunics, be marked by endurance, by utility, and by faith. Each frayed edge, each patch, each moment of wear represents experience, learning, and resilience. In this, we find a hidden beauty that surpasses any superficial elegance, a beauty rooted in authenticity and devotion. The clothing of the disciples also speaks to community. Their mantles, often shared for warmth and protection, symbolize the support and solidarity found in spiritual fellowship. In our own lives, we are called to recognize that devotion is rarely solitary. The small acts of care, listening, offering encouragement, providing for those in need, are the threads that connect us. Each action, though ordinary, contributes to a fabric of faithfulness that strengthens not only ourselves, but the community around us. This perspective shifts the focus from personal appearance or comfort to collective endurance and purpose. Even the ordinary act of repairing a garment carries spiritual resonance. When the disciples mended torn tunics, they performed a tangible act of stewardship. Similarly, in our daily lives, the care we extend to our responsibilities, our relationships, and our spiritual practices reflects our commitment to God's purpose. The process is humble, sometimes repetitive, and rarely glamorous, but it is essential. The narrative of the disciples shows that fidelity in small, consistent acts is as meaningful as monumental gestures. The grace of God often flows through the ordinary, shaping character and resilience in ways that are subtle but enduring. We are also invited to see the tension between necessity and aspiration. The disciples wore what they needed, no more, yet their purpose was boundless. In modern terms, we may find ourselves balancing practicality with vision, comfort with calling, or routine with the desire to step into the unknown. Their simple robes serve as a metaphor. External simplicity can coexist with extraordinary inner purpose. By embracing humility in our own lives, we open space for spiritual growth, courage, and divine guidance to flourish. The disciples' clothing also reminds us of vulnerability. To wear simple garments is to expose oneself to the elements, to fatigue, to discomfort, and yet they endured. Similarly, faith often calls us to step into uncertainty, to face challenges without the assurance of protection or reward. Our robes in life, whether they are emotional defenses, social facades, or practical resources, can be thin or worn, but our inner resilience, cultivated through trust and devotion, becomes the true armor. The disciples' example reassures us that simplicity, when paired with faith and purpose, can withstand trials more profoundly than opulence or pretense. Finally, reflecting on the disciples' attire leads to a gentle personal challenge, to evaluate how our lives bear witness to faith and purpose. Are our choices and daily habits aligned with the principles we profess? Do our actions, like the disciples' garments, endure and testify to commitment? The lesson is not about rejecting comfort or beauty, but about prioritizing substance, integrity, and devotion over superficiality. Each day offers an opportunity to live in a manner that is functional, humble, and faithful, letting our lives, like worn tunics, carry the story of endurance and devotion for all to see. If this reflection resonates, take a moment to share your thoughts or experiences below. Your story, like the disciples' robes, may inspire someone walking a similar path. Even the most faithful journey carries moments of doubt, struggle, and inner turmoil, and the lives of the disciples were no exception. Their simple robes, while symbols of humility and devotion, also served as silent witnesses to their vulnerabilities. Walking from village to village, facing storms both literal and spiritual, they bore the weight of uncertainty and fear. Imagine Peter, standing on the edge of the Sea of Galilee, his wet tunic clinging to his frame after a sudden downpour, wrestling with questions. Could he truly follow this teacher without faltering? Could he leave everything behind and trust fully? The fabric of his clothing mirrored the tension of his heart, worn, imperfect, yet enduring. Fear is perhaps the most constant companion of those called to purpose. The disciples confronted not only the harshness of their environment, but the skepticism of others, the pressure of expectations, and the internal struggle to remain steadfast. Each step carried anxiety, the weight of responsibilities, the unknown consequences of faith, and the looming threat of persecution. Their garments, patched and simple, became a metaphor for their inner resilience. Each tear represented a challenge met, each stitch a moment of courage, each worn hem a testament to persistence despite uncertainty. James and John, sons of Zebedee, must have felt similar tension. Their call to leave their family business and embrace a life of wandering discipleship demanded courage. Their robes, functional yet humble, remind us that following a higher calling often requires shedding the familiar and stepping into discomfort. The garments were not barriers, but companions in vulnerability, offering modest protection against harsh elements while reflecting the raw reality of their human fears. They were men who knew the earth beneath their feet and the fragility of human endeavor, yet their hearts were being trained to endure. Even in the moments of internal conflict, the disciples had to navigate social pressures. The religious authorities of the time, clad in garments that displayed status and piety, often challenged their path. The contrast between the disciples' plain attire and the elaborately fringed robes of the Pharisees was stark, a reminder that external simplicity could invite scrutiny or even ridicule. How often in our own lives do we face criticism or misunderstanding for choosing integrity over convenience, humility over ostentation, or faith over conformity? The disciples' experience reassures us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to remain faithful despite it. We also see moments of personal struggle in their interactions with one another. Tensions inevitably arose: Peter's impulsiveness, Thomas's doubt, the occasional lapses in judgment or loyalty. Their robes, constantly worn and mended, became silent witnesses to these interpersonal trials. The fabric held the echoes of disagreements, shared meals, moments of prayer, and the occasional tear of frustration or sorrow. It was in the ordinary context of daily life, clothed in simple garments, that their character was forged, stretched, tested, and ultimately strengthened by challenges both external and internal. Their obstacles were not only social or emotional, but spiritual. Following Jesus required a surrender that was radical, to trust without certainty, to speak without guarantees, to act without recognition. Every day brought a choice, to retreat into comfort or press forward in faith. The plain robes they wore were symbolic of this very surrender. No adornment, no claim to worldly security, only the courage to move forward in obedience. Even when the weight of doubt pressed upon them, the integrity of their mission remained, just as the integrity of their garments endured through constant wear. For modern viewers, this invites a deeply personal reflection. What are the fears and doubts we carry beneath the layers of our own lives? How do we face discomfort, criticism, or uncertainty while remaining true to our calling? The disciples' simple clothing and daily hardships remind us that vulnerability is not a weakness, but a necessary companion to growth. Each tear and patch, each worn sandal, mirrors the internal work of perseverance, resilience, and faith that builds character over time. And yet hope persists even amidst struggle. When Peter faltered in faith, when Thomas questioned, when James and John hesitated, the lessons of endurance were never lost. The garments that bore the wear of travel, labor, and adversity also bore witness to persistence. Even in failure, there was opportunity for learning. Even in fear, there was space for courage. Even in doubt, there was room for trust. The disciples teach us that the journey of faith is inseparable from the journey of the self, imperfect, tested, and ultimately transformed through perseverance. As we reflect on the trials and inner battles of the disciples, we are invited to stay present in our own struggles, to embrace our vulnerabilities, and to find courage in the simplicity of daily commitment. Their lives, clothed in humility and perseverance, show us that faith is not about perfection, but about steadfastness, the willingness to continue walking step by step, thread by thread, even when the path is uncertain. If you feel the weight of your own doubts today, remember their example and stay with the journey. There is strength to be found in endurance, and clarity often comes through the quiet perseverance of the everyday. In the midst of their trials and uncertainties, there came moments of profound transformation, moments when the disciples glimpsed the full weight of their calling and the vision of the kingdom they were invited to embody. It was in the plainness of their robes and the simplicity of their daily labor that clarity often emerged. The clothing they wore, humble as it was, became a lens through which they saw themselves not merely as men of Galilee, but as vessels for a purpose far greater than their own understanding. Each worn tunic and patched mantle symbolized endurance, each frayed edge a testament to faith tested and refined. Picture Peter standing on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, watching Jesus teach the crowds. His mantle, heavy from morning dew and travel, clung to his frame, yet he felt a stirring in his heart, a call to leave the nets and follow. The transformation was not sudden. It was gradual, woven through daily acts of service, moments of doubt, and shared prayers. The simplicity of his garment mirrored the simplicity required of faith, trust without pretense, obedience without fanfare, love without expectation. In that quiet alignment of heart and action, vision took root. James and John, too, experienced revelation in the rhythm of their journey, walking dusty roads, enduring storms, and listening to the parables. They began to perceive the magnitude of their mission. Their robes, worn and patched, bore witness to their perseverance. Each thread, each repair, became a symbol of spiritual growth, humility intertwined with courage, resilience woven with devotion. The ordinary fabric of their clothing reflected the extraordinary transformation occurring within, illustrating that change often happens not in grandeur, but in the consistent, faithful pursuit of purpose. Even Matthew, once bound by his life as a tax collector, found clarity in the humility of his new path. His garment, simple and functional, became a vessel for identity transformation. By leaving behind a life of security and stepping fully into discipleship, he experienced a vision of life measured not by wealth or status, but by service, obedience, and love. The fabric of his tunic, unadorned yet enduring, mirrored the spiritual truth that outward simplicity can coexist with inward abundance. In the ordinary and the humble, the disciples glimpsed the extraordinary. Transformation was not merely individual, but communal. When the disciples gathered, their garments overlapping in patches and folds, they shared warmth, sustenance, and encouragement. The visual unity of their plain robes reflected a deeper spiritual unity. Hearts aligned with the teaching of Jesus, committed to service and strengthened by fellowship. The shared mantle, the communal meals, and the long journeys together were not just practical. They were symbolic of the interwoven lives of those called to the kingdom. In these moments, the vision of a faithful community became tangible, embodied in their collective endurance and humility. The symbolism extended further in acts of service. When Jesus washed the disciples' feet, he touched the cloth of their labor-worn garments, emphasizing that true leadership and transformation flow through humility and action. Their robes, soaked with work and travel, carried the imprint of obedience. Each patch, each stain, each frayed edge spoke of engagement with the world, not withdrawal from it. Transformation, therefore, was not about changing appearances, but about aligning daily life with divine purpose. The disciples' outer simplicity mirrored their inner clarity. Faith is visible not through luxury, but through integrity, devotion, and perseverance. This vision reshapes the understanding of discipleship itself. To follow God's calling is to embrace the ordinary as sacred, to find the extraordinary within the mundane. The disciples' worn garments teach that spiritual insight often emerges not in grandiose moments, but in consistent, humble, faithful action. Each step along the road, each stitch sewn into a tunic, each act of compassion or courage became a building block in the architecture of faith. Their transformation was a slow, deliberate process, woven through time, effort, and experience. Much like the careful repairs of their robes, the lessons extend to our own lives. We are invited to see transformation not as a sudden, dazzling revelation, but as the accumulation of daily choices aligned with purpose. Our robes, the routines, responsibilities, and relationships that shape our existence, can bear witness to change when worn with intention and faith. Humility, perseverance, and courage, like the fabric of the disciples' garments, carry the imprint of growth and serve as visible signs of the inner transformation occurring within. Moreover, the vision of the disciples' transformation offers hope. It reassures us that even amidst fear, doubt, or failure, clarity and purpose can emerge. Just as Peter's impulsive nature evolved into steadfast leadership and Thomas's doubt gave way to conviction, we too can witness growth when we embrace humility, remain faithful in small acts, and lean into the divine call of our lives. The ordinary elements of our existence, approached with intentionality and faith, can become vessels for extraordinary insight. In reflecting on their journey, we are reminded that transformation is holistic. It encompasses heart, mind, and action, and even the simplest external details, the clothing worn, the sandals weathered, the sleeves patched, reflect the internal evolution of spirit and character. The disciples' experience illuminates a profound truth. The path of faith, walked with perseverance and humility, leads to vision, clarity, and enduring impact. If you feel inspired by this vision, share it with someone who may need to see that transformation is often woven quietly through the fabric of everyday life. As the story of the disciples draws toward its culmination, we return to the simple yet profound truth embodied in their garments. The forgotten clothes of Peter, James, John, Matthew, and the others are more than historical curiosities. They are living metaphors for faith, endurance, and humility. Every worn hem, every patched seam, every faded thread tells a story of a life devoted to purpose greater than self, a testimony of obedience, and a witness to the transformative power of following God's call. In these ordinary fabrics, we encounter extraordinary meaning. The narrative of their robes reminds us that legacy is rarely built on glamour or pretense. The disciples left no treasures of silk or gold. Their wealth was measured in steadfastness, love, and courage. Their worn tunics were a testament to a life fully lived in service to God and others. As they walked through Galilean villages, teaching, healing, and offering hope, the simplicity of their clothing did not diminish their presence. It amplified it. Humility became their cloak, perseverance their mantle, and devotion their most visible adornment. Even in the final chapters of their lives, the disciples carried the imprint of their journey through every tear and repair. Peter would face persecution, James would be martyred, and John would endure exile. Their garments, ever simple and practical, silently witnessed these trials. The outer simplicity of their robes mirrored the inner constancy of their faith. Stripped of worldly luxury, yet clothed in courage and divine purpose. Every thread, every patch, became a visual sermon of resilience, an invitation to consider what it truly means to live faithfully. The legacy of their attire extends to us today. In a world preoccupied with appearance, status, and surface-level success, the disciples' humble garments invite reflection. What are the robes we wear daily, metaphors for our choices, routines, and commitments? Do they bear witness to faith, integrity, and perseverance? Or have we allowed the external to overshadow the internal? By observing the disciples, we see that true greatness is rarely flashy. It is cultivated in quiet moments of dedication, in the patience to endure, and in the courage to align life with divine calling. Their clothing also speaks to the power of ordinary things. Sandals worn thin, tunics patched repeatedly, mantles heavy with travel. All remind us that the sacred is often hidden within the mundane. Life's ordinary elements, approached with faith and intention, carry profound significance. Every act of service, every humble gesture, every sacrifice made in love and obedience becomes a thread in the larger tapestry of purpose. The disciples' garments whisper this truth across the centuries. Holiness often walks quietly through daily life, visible only to those who look closely enough to see. And there is a final, resonant lesson in their simplicity. Vulnerability can be strength. The disciples' plain robes exposed them to weather, fatigue, and hardship, yet through that vulnerability they became instruments of God's work. Faith, too, calls us into exposure, moments of risk, uncertainty, and humility. But just as their garments endured storms, labor, and time, so too can our courage, patience, and devotion sustain us. Simplicity, far from being weakness, becomes a vessel for grace, resilience, and enduring impact. The journey of the forgotten clothes teaches us to honor both the seen and unseen. While we may not notice every fray or patch, each represents experience, sacrifice, and fidelity. Their robes become symbols for our own spiritual journey, reminding us that the measure of a life is not in external grandeur, but in the depth of commitment, the courage to endure, and the integrity to remain faithful when no one is watching. Through these ordinary garments, we glimpse the extraordinary, the enduring influence of faith lived fully, quietly, and courageously. As we close this reflection, imagine holding a faded tunic in your hands, worn by a man who walked the roads of Galilee, who preached, healed, and loved without fanfare. Let it remind you that faith is woven in daily acts, patience, humility, and perseverance. Let it inspire you to live visibly in alignment with your calling, to endure in your journey, and to embrace the quiet dignity of service. Their garments, though simple, carry a timeless message. The ordinary, when devoted to God, becomes sacred, and the humble path becomes the one that leaves a lasting legacy. If this story stirred something within you, consider sharing it, so that others may see that faith and purpose can be found not in the extravagant, but in the simple, enduring, and faithful threads of life. Let the legacy of the disciples' humble robes inspire your steps today and always.